So a big welcome to you. I'm Jeremy Lent, and just very excited to welcome you to this month's Deep Transformation Live Network meeting. And well, I don't need to tell any of you how polarization and conflict seem to be gaining the upper hand really throughout the whole world right now, whether it's the terrible conflict that's been happening for now almost a year between Israel and Palestine, or those racialized riots happened earlier, like last month in the UK, or the divisive election politics where I am here in the US. It just feels pretty much everywhere like our societies are fragmenting. And we clearly need to shift this trajectory. But how? Right? Well, today we have an opportunity to get a feeling for what might be possible in a conversation that DTN member Katy Byrne is going to be leading with three leading figures who've dedicated their lives to overcoming conflict. And let me just do a real brief introduction of Katy. Hi there, Katy. Katy is a columnist for The Sun in Sonoma, California, and she's been a psychotherapist for over 40 years. And Katy has spent really her long career creating forums for conversation and change and providing a safe place and facilitation for exploring really individual and social transformation and really a systemic bridging of divides. And Katy has recently published a book, in fact, From Conflict to Communication, where she shares some of her insights. And a few months ago, Katy reached out to me and told me about the vision she had for holding this important conversation here in the DTN. And so I'm just delighted that today this vision is getting realized. And so today, just to be clear, our session is going to be structured just a little bit different than usual. We'll begin with Katy in conversation with our three panelists for about half an hour. And then we'll go directly into a half-hour Q&A. And after that, we'll go into breakout groups. And we'll have a question we'll be discussing together in breakout groups. Then we'll come back to the main room for an informal get-together before we close the Zoom room for the day. So the session's going to last a little longer than normal. The breakout groups will probably take us to probably around 90 minutes. And then if you're able to stay around for an extra 10, 15 minutes, just for an informal chat, I'll be there, Katy will be there. That'll be just a nice way to get kind of closure after the breakout groups. In the first 30 minutes, if you have any questions or comments you'd like to share in the chat, that first part, do so. We'll try to collect those, and I'll intersperse some of them during our Q&A session in the second 30 minutes. So go ahead to do that. So I'm going to leave the spotlight now and then turn it over to you, Katy. Welcome, and please go ahead and introduce our three panelists. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. I'm pretty thrilled to be here in this position today after having been a participant for so long. I didn't have permission from Jeremy to do this, but I just want to say one thing to our panelists about Jeremy, if you don't know. He was described by the British Guardian journalist George Monbiot as one of the greatest thinkers of our age. And I just had to say that because his book, Web of Meaning, moved me so deeply that it brought me here. So now I want to introduce our guests. I've been deeply, deeply also moved by what I've read and seen from all three of you. You're all quoted in my book. And I just want to say, the thing, kind of reiterating what Jeremy said, is that you're all passionate about ending suffering, about ending the fighting and the rupture and trying to bridge the divides in our world. So starting with John. John, you're a national leader for Braver Angels, an organization bringing together conversations between people from the political right and left to hear and respect each other's different points of view. John, you're a former nominee for Congress, a writer and speaker on topics including racial and political reconciliation. Kathy Kelly has been nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize 3 times. She's the board president of World Beyond War and has recently coordinated the Merchants of Death War Crimes Tribunal. Kathy has been arrested more than 60 times and was sentenced to 9 months in federal prison. She's an advocate of nonviolence. She has traveled 27 times to Iraq, defying the economic sanctions. Richard Harwood, president and founder of the Harwood Institute for Public Innovation. He's an author and speaker. For over the decades, Rich has devoted his career to revitalizing the nation's hardest hit communities. He's been recruited to solve some of the most difficult problems of our time, including being called into Newtown, Connecticut after the massacre at Sandy Hook Elementary School. So today he's on a nationwide campaign I'm sure we'll hear about called Enough, Time to Build. So all of you have been in community and in the trenches of division with your hearts, hard work, and vision. Your pursuits have been courageous and with conviction toward ending polarization and building unification. What I'm hoping for today is dive deep first into the problems and then next into the solutions. What I always say in my psychotherapy practice is you can't really get a treatment plan until you have the diagnosis. So looking at the problems, my first question is for you, John. So you're now enveloped in Braver Angels. Can you tell us, some of us don't know, a little bit about Braver Angels, their mission, and what's been the hardest part of the work for you, especially being a Black man in a still prejudicial society?
Well, thank you very much for the setup, Katy, and I'm very much humbled to be a part of this gathering and to be in the company that I'm lucky and I think blessed enough to keep here. Rich, I can't remember if you and I crossed paths recently. I think we did, or perhaps your son was at our gathering as well. That may be the Harwood I'm remembering. But no, I'm pleased to be here and pleased to be here in the spirit with which we are convening. So Braver Angels, to say a little bit about the organization, is America's largest grassroots and cross-partisan organization dedicated to the work of political depolarization. But I tend to like to deepen that explanation by saying that what we are really about is reviving the communal fabric of American democracy, if you will. I think that we live in a time where the American experiment, young as it is in the larger scheme of things, has been running long enough with enough prosperity and sophistication to where we have forgotten that the fundamental component to the success of flourishing democracy is not merely voting, it's relationships. It's actually existing in a social fabric composed of the fibers of trust between individuals and between groups. And that trust is at the moment dissolving. Braver Angels began with a methodology of sort of family therapy. We started off by bringing together small groups of folks from the right and from the left, reds and blues, as we would say in-house, not so much to argue or debate politics or initially, but to speak from the vantage point of their own personal or lived experience in terms of why they see politics the way that they do. It was basically marriage counseling for Republicans and Democrats. That's sort of where we began. And from that starting point, we have built an organization, 13,000, 14,000 members across the country, 2,000 or 3,000 trained volunteers across America, over 100 or so local bipartisan alliances. You can think of them as Braver Angels chapters in different parts of America, and work that's unfolding in every level of government, Congress, state and local, college campuses across America, digital media work, art and culture, musicians and comedians and actors using their craft to help bridge the divide. But we are chiefly rooted in grassroots communities. So that's the sense of the shape of our work. And we have probably 20 some odd programs and tools that we use to help foster connection across different aspects of the social political divide. You asked me, Katy, sort of what has been challenging about our work for me, and perhaps in the context of being an African American. Um, it's that's an interesting question. I think the first thing that comes to my mind is having a deep sense that part of what occasions the friction we experience in society is the vastness of the unseen and the unheard in American life. I think that all human beings have a desire to be seen, a desire to be heard. Sometimes we think that people are insisting that we agree with them, but a lot of times that insistence on ideological agreement is really just sort of a raising of one's hand high in the air to say, hey, I exist, my life has meaning, right? But, I would like to feel that reflected back to me in the world around me. And I think that part of what is salient about the Black experience in general is that there's a disproportionate number of people in Black American society that feel unheard, who in various different ways are striving to be made visible. Now, that question has a little bit of nuance for me, Katy, because I, as an individual, don't really feel that way. Yeah. I grew up in a multiracial, multicultural home and community where I felt very much valued. But where the difficulty came in for me was that I lived alongside other Black kids who came from very different socioeconomic circumstances, and I married into a Black family for whom that was not the case, right? And so I oftentimes experience this somewhat there's a playfully awkward kind of reality to things for me, in which you sort of like I can be asked to shine a light on the experiences of people with whom I share a broader racial identity, but whom socioeconomically I know come from a different set of challenges. And interestingly, for many other Black people who grew up more the way I grew up, there's a desire not to necessarily be seen as having a struggle that we don't necessarily have. And so the racial conversation becomes confusing. And on the other end of this, because I'm half white, my father is a white Southerner. And so that gives me a particular sort of relationship to that part of America's racial identity. And part of what I feel about many, particularly poor white people in America, particularly many Southerners, particularly a lot of folks in Appalachia and these parts of the country, is that they too feel unseen and sort of as they're lumped together in sort of a narrative of white privilege and supremacy and so on and so forth, feel that their stories are not really being surfaced in the American narrative as well. And that gives them something in common with many of the poor Black people who I know directly in my family, who have their own experience with marginalization in America, which is a little bit more familiar to many of us. So the challenge for me in our work is creating space for all of our stories to be shared in a way that validates and humanizes the dignity of people from all walks of life, without one story seeming to push out room that could be made available for the other. If we don't create the space for all of our stories to enter the conversation in a way in which we all can be heard, there will never be universal buy-in for an idea of America which is fully and totally inclusive, which means that you will always have the opportunity for demagogues and people who seek to exploit our divisions to wage those antipathies against each other for political gain. And so that was probably a far longer answer than than it was appropriate to take time to deliver, but hopefully that gives some sense as to where I approach this work from.
Thank you, John, and thank you for the disclosure, and also for the theme that I imagine will unfold more about wanting to be seen, the longing to be seen and heard, and how that is so missing in our world. So I want to introduce Kathy Kelly. Honored to meet you, Kathy. So blown away by some of the things I've read in your books. And so anyway, in your book, Other Lands Have Dreams, it's described how the United Nations workers in Iraq stood there and did not give supplies to family. You know, many of us sitting here today have not been in the middle of war-torn countries. Can you tell us a little bit about what it's been like for you? What's your experience of it, and what do you want to impart to us about that?
Well, thank you, Katy. You know, I've sensed that amongst John and Richard and you, there's a strong sense of that's maybe summed up in that question. I think you mentioned it, Richard. Native people saying not how are you, but how are your connections?
Oh.
And in a way, going into a war zone connected me with realities again and again that I simply could never have understood on my own. I think that perhaps I could express it. I don't want to be swerving too far away from the way you posed the question, but you know, in the process of trying to prevent wars or protest wars, I have been arrested and gone to federal prison a number of times. And there was a time when I had protested at a military base that was training people who were being disappeared and sorry, training soldiers that were responsible for disappearing and torturing and murdering people in Central and South America. And what I didn't realize is many of those soldiers were on their way to Iraq as MPs. Yeah. And, you know, I'd gone through the drill enough times that it was almost like going through, you know, TSA at O'Hare Airport. And I'm a good Catholic. I do what I'm told. So they said, you know, go to this station, and the handcuffs were snipped off, and I was told to raise my arms, and I did, and spread your legs, and I did. But the 5 soldiers were screaming orders at each of us. And I was one of about 40 people, and most of them were older than me. Many were nuns and priests. And I thought, well, this is kind of odd that, so the high school study teacher in me came out, and I turned to the soldier who was screaming orders at me. And I just said, excuse me, but could you help me understand why you're screaming at me? Well, then the search became even more aggressive. The soldier said, don't say anything, keep your eyes glued on the soldier in front of you, raise your arms higher, spread your legs further. And he's screaming these orders. And I'm looking at, you know, these elderly nuns and priests being subjected to the same thing. And at a certain point, I don't know, it just seemed like the most natural thing to do. I said, I'm sorry, but I can't cooperate with this any longer. And I lowered my arms. Wham! I was down on the floor, black eye from the impact. My wrists were tied, my ankles were tied, my wrists and ankles were tied together. And somebody who might have been about your size, Richard, was kneeling on me and referring to me with an expletive. And so I said, I can't breathe. And nothing. The soldier didn't get up, and I thought, I'm going to lose consciousness. I have to say something. So I said, excuse me, but this really hurts and I can't breathe. And nothing. And so finally I said, and it was hard to get the words out. I said, look, I've had 4 lung collapses and I can't breathe. And that did it. The soldier got off of me. I'm still hogtied, but I got a few breaths, and actually my lungs were glued up after I had congenital diseased tissue and 4 lung collapses, but my lungs probably can't fall down, but in a pinch. So anyway, I realize now, Katy, that the reason that story was so important in my life is because had I not been a white person, had I said, I can't breathe, and been, as you would recall, George Floyd, I might not have survived. And so we get these opportunities to make connections, to understand, and very, very often, we only understand a tiny fraction of what's happening to other people, and then to the species and to the Mother Earth, as we must also listen to the cry of Mother Earth. So it's humbling, and there's no way we can ever act commensurate to the accountability that's needed. But we we do get ways to connect. And that's a great gift.
Whew. Thank you, Kathy. Took my breath away. Yeah, it does seem like the stories that we tell, as John said, the stories need to be told, don't they? Yeah, thank you. Thank you. So Rich, whew, you've been involved in places like Flint, Michigan, with so much suffering, including water crisis, persistent poverty, and crime. In order to deepen the conversation even more, can you tell us a little bit about, the conversations you've heard? Tell us what you feel and hear from people in these communities and around us.
Yeah, well, I don't know if I should thank you for having me go last after hearing Kathy and John so eloquently speak about their work and experiences. I was recently I didn't come in thinking about this, but I was just thinking about it. I was recently in Selma, Alabama, where I was asked to keynote the NAACP annual banquet. And I'd spent a number of days there. I'd been there before. We're all hoping that we might be able to do some work together. And I'm struck every time I go there, but I was struck yet again by, so many of us go to Selma to walk over the Edmund Pettus Bridge. We make a pilgrimage. The pilgrimage is for a day, maybe a couple of days. Maybe we engage in some conversation, and that's good. There are others who, when we go to Selma, what we see is the open storefronts, the empty storefronts, the dilapidated housing, the potholes in the streets. We see the physical nature of the community. And so, so often I think when we work with folks in communities, we see something like the Edmund Pettus Bridge. We might celebrate it. That's good. We see empty storefronts, dilapidated buildings, the potholes in the community. I think it's important to see that as well. But what we don't see when we go to places like Flint, Michigan, what we don't see when we go to places like Youngstown, Ohio, when we don't see is when we go to places like Jackson, Mississippi, where we've done a lot of work. What we don't see, is involved with folks after the campfire in Butte County, California, Northern California. I'm going back out there in a couple of weeks. What we don't see in Newtown oftentimes, what we don't see in the 40 other countries where our work has spread, is people.
Mhm.
We don't see people. And when we do, we kind of objectify them. We make all sorts of judgments about what they believe, what they think, what they feel, what they've experienced, what they want. But we don't actually, as John and Kathy said, we don't really know their lived experiences. We don't know their stories. Even more than that, I don't think we think enough, and this may be veering into solutions, I don't mean to, but I don't think we see enough the underlying conditions that require us to address if we're going to move forward with any sense of hope. In the end, people always ask me, what's your work about? I always say, well, at the end of the day, my work's about hope. I grew up in a hospital bed. I was diagnosed with cystic fibrosis as a child. And I lived much of my youth and a good part of my young adulthood in a hospital bed. And if there's anything that I learned what it means to not be seen and heard, what it means to be invisible, what it means to be repeatedly violated through tests and to have your dignity stripped from you, what it means to have a system that was supposed to heal me do more harm than good, what it means to watch my parents keep me out of the hospital late at night so that the clock could tick to 12:01 so they wouldn't have to pay for that day. What I've learned through this is what people want more than anything is a sense of hope. that tomorrow can be better than today. When I was growing up, tomorrow wasn't going to be better than today. That's what I learned from experience. But I kept working at it and hoping to move toward it. And so for me, and what I wanted more than anything was to get out of bed and get moving with my life. So what animates me today in this work is I think people want to get up and get moving. We're all seeking to move forward. We're all seeking not to fix problems in our lives, but to create something with our lives, to create something with one another, to create things in our families, to create things in our communities, to create things as a nation, to create things as a society. And so for me, wherever it may be that where we're working with folks and where they're leading the change, it's how can we get moving in a more hopeful way that gives people a greater sense in our belief in ourselves and in one another that we can actually come together and get things done and create things moving forward. And that tomorrow maybe, just maybe, might be better than today. And in that, we can create a trajectory that is upward sloping. I think too much of the work that takes place in our communities, in our society, in different countries is downward sloping. It starts with great fanfare. It starts with a press conference. It starts with a press release. It starts with a lot of great speeches. And then they just fizzle out. And I think what we ought to be paying more attention to is how do we grow things that have increasing momentum over time with ever expanding civic confidence and a greater sense of hope in ourselves and in one another? So, but I think to do that, I'll just close with this. It means we're going to have to see things that we don't ordinarily like. We're not practiced in seeing. We don't have in our line of sight. They make us uncomfortable.
Yeah.
They challenge us. They strike fear in our own hearts.
Yeah.
They sometimes make us cry.
Yeah.
That struggle, those struggles, when we engage with them, as you know, as a therapist, right? That's the basis upon which we can create something different.
Yeah.
And I think that's, I think we need to be paying a lot more attention to that.
Thank you, Rich. You have a gift of all of you. It's so hard to portray for me to put things into words. I'm used to listening a lot of my day, and I'm so impressed that you can all capture some parts of the human condition. And I can feel that we're going to move. We're all passionate about change, and I can imagine we're going to move into that topic quickly. But I want to say one quick thing, if it's all right, because I want to address again what you just said, all of you, really, thank you, in talking about the authentic problems and how we don't see things. And until we tell our stories and until we see and hear each other, there's not a solution for conflict. And I want to read this one or two lines from something that Kathy wrote and have you comment on it, Kathy, briefly. You wrote it in in Iraq in 2003. I remember sitting on a bench outside of an emergency room. Next to me, a woman convulsed in sobs, asking, "How will I tell him? What will I say?" She needed to tell her nephew she was undergoing emergency surgery, that he had not only lost both his arms and that she was now his only surviving relative. A U.S. bomb had hit Ali Ababa's family as they shared a lunch outside their home. A surgeon later reported that he had already told Ali that they amputated both his arms. But Ali asked him, "Will I always be this way?" Kathy wrote, I returned to the Al Fanar Hotel that evening, feeling overwhelmed by anger and shame. Alone in my room, I pounded my pillow, tearfully murmuring, "Will we always be this way?" So
Hmm.
with that, I want to open the conversation to Kathy. Will you comment on that?
Well, thank you. You know, Ali Abbas did survive that horrible ordeal.
Mm.
And I encountered him listening to a BBC radio program interviewing him. And this young man was asked by the interviewer, Ali, now that you've learned English and you've made such an adjustment to your new home, what is it that you most want to become? And he said, I believe he was 16 at the time, and he said, I am not sure, but I believe I want to do the things that make for peace. And, you know, so many times in Iraqi hospitals, the mothers would pull us right into the bedside with them. They'd be cross-legged holding an infant, and none of those infants would survive. It was the death row for infants. And it wasn't the fault of the UN workers. They were desperate to try to heal and help. But the economic sanctions the United States had imposed on Iraq were directly punishing children. And I remember one mother, I mean, it was for a lack of a tiny piece of plastic
Yeah.
that her child couldn't survive. They had the oxygen, but they didn't have the supply of plastic tubing that would fit this child's nostril. And so the doctor, Qasai al-Rahimi, said, I'm sorry, your child cannot live. And she pulled me next to her. My shoulder was damp from her tears. And what she said to me was, believe me, Kathy, I pray that this will never happen to a mother who is from your country. And that kind of forgiveness is just stunning. And I believe what everyone has said so far about relationships and about the challenge for those relationships to grow. And I suppose what's especially hard, though, is to wrap our mind around the idea that our relationships ought to embrace every sentient being, every living being.
Right.
And that if we don't listen to Earth and try to abolish war, we'll have a very hard time going forward.
Thank you. Thank you. That was really, again, I'm speechless. So I want to check in with you, Jeremy. I think it's getting to be time for the Q&A. Am I right?
I think that it's fine if you want to just continue for another 5 or 10 minutes of this conversation, then we'll turn to the to the Q&A. If you want to just turn to John and Rich and just explore something with them, and then why don't we go to Q&A?
Okay. Great. John, I would like to just open it for you to comment on something that's coming up for you at the moment. Like I say, I know that there's a looming question here, which is how do we, the name of our topic today, which is how do we end conflict? It's a pretty big question, but tell me what's coming up for you at the moment.
Well, let me just say that it's edifying listening to you, Rich, and Kathy. Your experiences are so profound and poignant. I almost wonder why they put me on here sitting next to a person like yourself. I'm very honored to have the opportunity to listen to your reflections. I didn't know anything about you before this, so it's a pleasure. Well, so I do work in a broadly political environment, even as I bring a sort of humanist and philosophical perspective and approach to the world of politics. And the thing about politics is that conflict of a certain type, at least, is not only inevitable but necessary. I mean, human beings, we do exist in the friction that arises from our competing interest. And I think that part of the goal and striving of humanity has to be the realization of the ways of interaction that are available to us that allow us to pursue the win-win situations that are possible when you actually love and trust each other and are able to identify with people who don't natively have, similar dispositions or histories to yourself. And I think that part of the struggle with American history and American identity is the fact that we have simultaneously made great strides in that direction while also continuing to fall so far short of what most of us, I think, would know to be ideal, that we get artificially polarized between those of us who sort of can blindly see no wrong in the American way of doing things, and those of us who are so understandably scarred by the traumas of our history and even our present that we forget to be grateful about what's right and good in America. For me, the only thing that crosses all of these chasms is love. And I mean that in a concrete sort of way. I try as much as I can be to be a student and a practitioner of the philosophy of nonviolence, but I am most acquainted with it through the tradition of Martin Luther King Jr. And Dr. King, the foundation of nonviolence, in his view, as a philosophical matter, was agape love, this overarching goodwill for humanity. And so he believed in agape love as a spiritual force which could affect social transformation. And in his own time, he said that we seek not to defeat or humiliate the opponent, not to defeat or humiliate the white man, but to win his understanding and his friendship so that we might be reconciled to one another in the beloved community. I do think that ultimately there is, whether you're religious or not, there is an internal sort of lowercase s spiritual disposition of goodwill that we have to be able to summon as a reality of our attitude, as a reality of the way in which we feel about other people emotionally, even when they hate us, even when they lie to us, even when they act towards us in an ignorant way. Because when we shine the light of love on other people, we highlight those places in their conscience that might still be available to responding to something that's true. That was Dr. King's understanding of the power of love, that through agape love, you could maximize your ability to speak to the conscience of your enemy, to speak to the conscience of the opposition. In so doing, maximizing your ability to turn their heart to another path. But even if you fail in that in the first go round, you at least relieve yourself of the albatross of fear and judgment and contempt. So in American politics, it can be hard for us sometimes to advocate for the humanity of one group without blaming another group for having imposed a paradigm of non-justice, let's say, of injustice. And that's understandable. But the challenge becomes, can we maintain an empathy and a sympathy that goes in 360 degrees, advocating for those who are being oppressed, while still recognizing that the oppressors themselves are often also victims of a larger history and generations of trauma that set us on the course we're on. And so obviously I would like to take more time on this point, but I think I'll just summarize by saying that love really is the power that conquers all. And when you apply love to the projects of democracy and justice, I think you pave a pathway towards human flourishing that ultimately all people can find their way towards in the fullness of time.
Thanks, John. That's quite a vision you have there for politics. We have our work set out for us, don't we? I mean, Rich, can you comment on whatever is coming up for you, but also it seems like the feeling around all of the sharing we're doing today has to do with the need, the longing to be seen and to have our stories told, that we live in this kind of plastic, as Kathy used the image of a piece of plastic, that we live in this world that we don't really get the stories. We don't really hear each other. We don't, I think you said, instead of asking, how are you, ask, how are your relations?
Yeah. So let me see if I can just, Kathy, you so beautifully talked about forgiveness. And John, you just spoke about love. And it's true that that I think so much in our society, we've created substitutes for those, right? We've created, when we talk to people about how we're going to get moving, we've created substitutes of, well, highly mechanized responses. We've created substitutes of metrics for things like forgiveness or love. So forgiveness or love just sort of gets crowded out. We think that the only way to create change is through comprehensive plans. We need to gather as many people as possible around a table and try to coordinate them as best we can with all the things that people learn, as I learned in graduate school, and try to make something happen. And I think in the process of doing these things, we've squeezed out or crowded out our civic impulses. We've crowded out our ability to come together and not only talk to each other, but to get things done. So there's a part of me as I was listening is I just want to go down a continuum of forgiveness, which it seems to me is a human imperative, love, a human imperative. I think there's a human and civic imperative, another piece to this that I just want to raise here, because I'd be remiss if I didn't, which is the very capabilities we need in society to enable these things to arise, for enable these things to have space, for enable these things to flourish, for enable people to come together and work together, have atrophied.
Yeah.
So we don't have leaders whom we trust and who are turned outward toward us. We don't have organizations whose business, not enough, we once did in some cases, but many of them have either atrophied or become simply political advocates. We don't have organizations who make it their mission to help people come together across dividing lines, who help as their mission to be catalytic in what they're trying to create and then spin it off for others to do. Everyone needs to be in front of the parade all the time, right? We need to take credit for things we didn't even do. We don't pay enough attention to building the networks we need in communities for not show and tell, not coordination, but for innovation and civic learning, for shared learning that propels us forward. We have made it a business to create norms that divide us, that separate us, that strike fear into one another's hearts. But we don't make it our business to create norms that bring us together, that enable people to say things, as folks in Lexington, Kentucky say to me all the time, I'm afraid to say anything because I'm going to make waves. I'm going to now get excluded. We talk about collaboration, but all we do is we get together. We don't really work together.
No.
Right. So it seems to me that I could keep going, but we don't have, in many of the places where we're working, people don't have a shared sense of purpose.
Yeah.
Right. So all of these things contribute, I think, to our inability to exercise forgiveness, to our inability to exercise love, to our inability to have a sense of shared sense of humanity, and in our inability to get up and get moving and do something. I happen to believe that more than anything, we need to take action together. We need to build together, create together for all sorts of reasons. So I think one of the things that as I listen to this conversation, I want to connect to the things that Kathy and John said, the need for us to pay attention to what I would call the civic culture of our communities, because in my experience, at least, that's been the biggest predictor of whether or not these other things can flourish and be made real and sustainable over time, and to be a counterforce to the kinds of conflict and polarization and fear that we have in society.
Katy, if I could just add 5 seconds to what Rich just said. I often describe the work of Braver Angels as building out an infrastructure for the swelling of goodwill, one that can move through communities and institutions. And so as a practical matter, I think Rich's point is entirely correct. We can have the spirit, and then the question becomes, what are the pathways through which the spirit must travel to be able to move the conscience of society, in a way that matches the scale of the impasse, so to speak.
Absolutely.
Point is
And that speaks to what Jeremy has created here, which is a pathway, a place for dialogue, a place for profound and important truth-telling and solutional thinking and vision. And I wonder now if it's time to include people with the questions.
Mhm. Yeah, so thanks for that, Katie. And let's just invite at this point anybody who has a question for the panelists or wants to share a reflection. So please raise your Zoom hand and get in line. And a few questions have been arising in the chat. So let me just kick things off with a question. Well, it was actually a comment, but it could easily be rephrased as a question, which I think is crucial, from Mark Doris, who said, "I'm not sure we can talk about conflict and its resolution without talking also about power and wealth." So if we can just kind of turn that into a question and really ask the panelists, do you agree with that? And if so, how do we talk about some of these really difficult topics of power and wealth in ways that do not create further conflict?
Mm.
I spotted that question, and I remembered being a senior in college, and Noam Chomsky came to speak at Loyola University, Mundelein College, and he said that in the United States understanding of foreign policy, the United States said to every other country around the world, if you do not subordinate yourselves to fulfill our national interest, we will eliminate you. And I found that throughout my adult life, that was reinforced again and again. And I think it is an earnest and very wrong-headed, cruel desire to control other people's resources and to take other people's resources at cut-rate prices. And much of it often has to do with having the upper hand because of our overwhelming nuclear arsenal and other conventional weapons, and being able to showcase these weapons and terrify other people by saying, yeah, we will use those if you don't fulfill our perceived national interest. But of course, what we're seeing over and over again right now in our world facing ecological collapse is that our interest is all bound up in being able to collaborate with other countries and other peoples and understand them and speak their languages in order to come to grips with the greatest threats we face of nuclear annihilation, of ecological collapse, and of even possible further pandemics. So I think that question of letting go of the perceived imperative to have wealth is so important. I think of Robin Kimmerer's great story about the hunter who was asked by an anthropologist, well, why did you throw a party and spend all your hard-earned resources after the hunt? You fed and the hunter said, I store my wealth in my neighbor's belly.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I think I would, that's a great that's a great anecdote. I think I would add to that, just in reflecting on the Dr. King's teachings. Dr. King was somebody who did not really value personal wealth. He was somebody who, of course, spoke truth to power, but also valued power in this formulation. Dr. King believed in power coupled with love, and he said that love without power is weak and anemic, and power without love is authoritarian and brutal. I think that we in the human race are heir to a grossly flawed nature, filled with fear, competition, belief in scarcity, and traumas that have been and intertribal conflicts that have been handed down to us across the course of generations. And we are faced with the task of governing society and being stewards of the resources of the world. And I think that the challenge is not just to critique power, but to be imaginative enough to understand how we might creatively and constructively and compassionately use wealth and power to be able to create the world that we would want to see. One is not really enough in the absence of the other, because we've seen any number of revolutions in human history that have begun with a humanistic sort of purpose, and then they manage to, in some cases, achieve power while having left love behind. And all you get in that is a new dressing on the perpetuation of an old cycle, right? So
Well put, John. I didn't mean to interrupt you, but
No, no,
we
no.
have a lot of questions out here. I guess Barnaby, you look
Mhm.
like you're interested in asking something.
Yeah, hello everyone. It's also just outrageously moving. I'm a bit of an old dad. I have an 8-year-old and a 4-year-old, and watching the news, listening to your stories, it hits home so viscerally, and turns on the waterworks. I have been pursuing an idea of forging networking to forge a global meta movement for a majority world led meta movement for peace, and something for a global ceasefire, and for citizens' peace assemblies to be set up between warring nations, and for referendums, actually preferenda votes, which are non-binary, therefore non-divisive, so people get to vote on proposals, a range of proposals put forward by citizens' peace assemblies. But something's just occurred to me whilst listening to you all, and the notion of love being integral, is that perhaps participants of those citizens' assemblies, chosen from the social makeup, apart from one aspect, is that they should all be parents.
Mhm.
and their families be looked after whilst they're attending these citizen assemblies to try and find some compromise, so we bypass the corrupt leaders on all sides. I don't know if that's a question, but it's not really, so I apologize for that, but thank you for everything that you do.
Thank you, Barnaby. I,
Yeah.
was there another question, or I
well,
have one?
there's like a few in the chat, so let me just put one
Okay.
in the chat, and then to you, Katy, and then Midi, I see, has also raised a hand. Wally Hicks asked, how do we create a place for dissent in the nest building of humanity? Which I thought was a crucial question. Yeah, we want to collaborate, we want to put together, but there needs to be that dissent too. So how can that be done skillfully? And obviously Barnaby just mentioned citizens' assemblies, which is one great, but I wonder what thoughts panelists have on that.
Well, I'll just mention that in Braver Angels' work, debate is actually a big part of what we do. It's not where we started. We started with the sort of, left-right couples therapy sort of work. But part of how we've evolved is to innovate debate, which of course is a necessary part of democracy and politics, but with a spirit that really prioritizes intellectual humility and the communal pursuit of truth, if you will. We have a program that allows any and everybody to speak, whether you're a professor or your janitor or even the cameraman who didn't know what he was filming. And the idea is that whether it's immigration or criminal justice reform or foreign policy, that people speak from their own personal experience, that they bring data to the conversation, but they also are open about their uncertainty. And I think that the baseline thing that makes it work is the fact that there's a great openness of everybody participating to hear the personal truth and perspective of the person who's speaking, regardless of what their opinions are, so long as they are there in a spirit of goodwill. So this goes back to Kathy's point about forgiveness, I think, and what I would call grace. Like we need to accept the fact that if you're not making space for a person to show up as all of who they are, they're sort of not there at all. And so we can talk about love and various different values, but if there's not space for people to show up in their imperfections, we haven't made room, you know. And so the allowance of dissent has to be a part of that. I think so long as the spirit of agape love, of goodwill, is there, even alongside whatever the point of disagreement might be.
Thank you, John. That was eloquent. Rich, did you have something?
Well, I was just going to say, I think, I was once asked in an interview, what's your ideal view of community? And I think the interviewer assumed that I would say harmony. And actually, my answer was tension.
Yeah.
But I think in order for society to operate, we need tension, which obviously is different than conflict. But I do think we need tension. And I think so often in our society right now, particularly around dissent or different points of view, we're essentially trying to either split the difference or find some compromise, when in fact, I think we ought to be focused much more on what is it that we're seeking to create together, which I've found actually provides an alternative pathway for people forward. So we're less locked into our points of view or our positions, but more articulating what we're for. I think in order to do that, I'm just going to come back to civic culture. We've got to create the spaces. We've got to create the mechanisms. We've got to create the norms. This is about norms, ultimately. We've got to create the norms that enable us to work together, which I think is a rebuilding process in our communities. One of the challenges I have a lot with my field is that there's this belief if we simply have better conversations, everything's going to be better. I don't believe that. I think if we have better civic cultures that enable us to work together and create things together, we will loosen up and unlock our ability to find enough agreement, just enough so that we can actually work together, create things together, move forward together, and in the process, regain a sense of civic confidence and create a stronger trajectory moving forward. And I think I think we'd be wise to spend a little bit more time on that.
Katy, you want to ask your question, and then maybe after that we can turn to Midi.
Well, my head's so full. I've got about 5 things. Maybe I should, I mean, I guess what's coming up just briefly for me, because I really want to hear from other people. I see that Midi's waiting to make a question or comment. I just, I wonder if there's too much fear of speaking up. I wonder if there's too much, a lack of ability to work through conflict, so that even if we are involved in a civic endeavor, let's say we're all building a co-housing community, or we're all at the city council meeting building more housing, or we're working together, or maybe we're even protesting together, as we talked about. I worry that when we run into conflict, we don't have the skills or the ability, or even the idea, the story in our heads that conflict is okay and we can talk through it. So that's just my little tidbit. Rich, did you want to
I
argue?
just quickly come into it. I think this strikes at the heart of how we conceive of change. I think right now, one of the ways in which we conceive of change, at least in the States, but this is true in other countries where I've worked, is this comprehensive big combustion, collective effort that all of a sudden is going to like fall from the sky or emerge out of the ground in perfect form and move us forward.
Yeah.
We're working in Reading, Pennsylvania right now, which 10 years ago was declared the poorest community in America.
Yeah.
They created a community-led education equity agenda and are creating change on it now 2 years later. And the reason why, Katy, to your question about fear, they have more fear there than almost any other community I've worked in, is they started small. Their actions began small. The number of people began small. And over time, they catalyzed and unleashed a chain reaction of actions and ripple effects that grew over time. And as they did, they grew their civic confidence, they grew their shared narrative, and more people joined the effort as they became less fearful. And they began to see that they could join something and add to something and contribute to something over time. That required a fundamentally different notion of how change occurs, the length of time it takes, and what contributions are necessary moving forward. And I think that's one of the ways, not the only way, but one of the ways that I think we can start to deal with the conflict and with fear. To John's point, the lack of love, or at least the lack of people's willingness to express a certain kind of love publicly or civically. I think we can begin to deal with those things in really practical. For me, ultimately, this has to be practical, because we're talking about people's lives and their hopes and their yearnings for their lives, for their children, for themselves, for their neighbors, and for our society. And I think ultimately this has to become very practical.
Thanks.
Katy, I wonder if I could just interject that I think we should follow the young people. You know, all across the world, young people said, no, we cannot look away from what's happening to children in Gaza. These are children, and they ought never to be punished to death. You can't hold children accountable for any kind of party or military group. And so when at Columbia University, the students flung out of a window a big banner that said Hind's Hall. They renamed the hall after Hind Rajab, a little 5-year-old girl who was in a car. The car was hit, and she had witnessed the death of her auntie and uncle, 3 of her cousins. And so she was on the phone with a switchboard operator with the Red Crescent, and they said, just wait, we're coming. Someone is going to come and get you. And she begged, are you coming soon? Please, I'm so scared. And then tank-fired missiles were fired at first at the ambulance drivers and workers who had gone to try and save her, who thought they were safe, and then at Hind herself. And so those students were very, very practical in saying, stop slaughtering children. And that's been carried all around the world in such edifying ways. And I think people are sometimes afraid of the student initiative. But, you know, courage is, and I've learned this from each one of you on this panel and from the reading I've done, courage isn't, in a sense, well, you've got to control your fear. Everyone feels fear. Yeah. And that friction, as you've said, John, can be very good. But we ought not to be controlled by our fears. And I'm afraid that big governments are quite frightened of the weapon makers, the war makers. They don't want to alienate them. They don't want to lose that support from these major military corporations. And they don't want to lose the support of groups like AIPAC. And so we have to encourage people to overcome the sense that they can only be controlled by their fear.
Well put. I mean, I'm glad we're addressing the fears and the hopes and the vision. Mitty, you've been so patient. Would you like to comment or ask a question? Yeah.
Thank you so much. I'm actually very happy to follow Kathy, because if I would offer a comment, it would be that I am deeply encouraged by the young people I spend time with, because I think they're moving beyond the kind of polarities that I see my generation and maybe the next generation down from me still getting stuck in. But I love the sense that the young actually know what needs to happen. and will take us forward. But I actually put my hand up because I would love to ask each of you a question. I've heard a lot about the we. I'd love to ask each of you to say personally, when you find yourself in conflict, what's your personal strategy in that moment? Thank you.
Great question.
Yeah, that is a great question. I do have to admit, I think that I am conflict is hardest for me when it is with people with whom I am particularly close. If it's if it's my wife or my dad, I feel like I'm oftentimes not at my best in those in those situations. Because when there's history and so forth, you can have a way of getting sucked so deep into your own emotions that the larger truth, which is that we all show up as we do in a certain moment as a consequence of events and factors that we have inherited that we do not control or ask for. It's harder to realize that so as to sustain that separation. But my general strategy is to emphasize that. I had a boxing teacher who was a famous martial artist who told a story about a man in a boat who saw a man in a yacht who saw a boat floating towards it, a small boat, a canoe. And he started screaming at the person in the canoe to move his boat, to move the canoe. He could have moved his own boat, but he had the right of way. The canoe was drifting down the current and finally struck his boat. And he went to the edge of his boat and he shouted at the person angrily, only to realize that the canoe was empty the entire time. All right. The point being that we are all empty canoes, essentially. I can't really, I have to remove judgment of other people from myself, because if I blame you fundamentally for being who you are and in the circumstances that you're in, that I can't judge, not just socioeconomically, but psychologically and emotionally and so forth, then I give myself some self-righteous justification for engaging you from a place of ego. If I see all of us, however, as having landed on this rock without having chosen the particular circumstances and bodies and so forth in which we are here, that we are all in some sense, victim to things we can't control and therefore need each other to help lift one another up, then I give myself permission to look at everybody with a sense of compassion and goodwill, right? And so that's my strategy. And if I can signal that in my tone, in my speech, and in my body language, it tends to do a little bit to bring that sort of attitude out in others as well. So that's a general answer.
Thanks, John. I guess I want to make a quick comment on that since I wrote a whole book about it. I personally find, though I preach and work with conflict in families and couples all day long, that when I'm triggered, it's very difficult for me to really speak to what I'm feeling and needing and facilitate a conversation while I'm triggered. I think this work really that we need to learn to do is it's imperative that we learn to understand how to have conflict. And the two things I'll throw out for you, one is if I can remember, because I'm triggered and I'm scared, I'm anxious, I'm sweating, or I'm angry or hurt. If I can remember, I try to say my main intention, which is I really want to keep this friendship. It's precious to me. I love you. And can we just hear each other and, just have a different opinion or tell each other the stories in our head. Because here's the story in my head. So those are the two little snippets I have. How about you, Rich?
Yeah, lots of things going through my mind. One, just to pick up on a point that you were just making, I think memory is really important. and we're all shaped by our memories, right? And I think in moments of conflict, those memories, particularly ones that, Katy, to your point, that are rooted in fear, that are rooted in trauma, that are rooted in certain experiences, sort of have a way of rising up within us and shaping us. So I think one is to be mindful. I think a lot of this is about mindfulness. So part of this is to be mindful of your memory and to be quick about making discernments about what's really at work here. So I think that's one piece. I think the other thing to think about is the other part of what's at work here is what is our purpose in being here, in being in this space, in being in this work. And so to me, again, that requires a certain kind of discernment. It requires a high level of intentionality and a high level of purposefulness, right? Like, what is my purpose here? And I think if you can combine, at least for me, if I can combine those two things, I would probably speak about this differently in a different venue, but for the moment, if I can remind myself of my memories and the ways in which they're shaping what I'm thinking and feeling in the moment, and if I can remind myself of my purpose and work with discernment and intentionality, I find that things work out a lot better. And I think that as part of that, last thing I'll say is, and I think, John, you alluded to this, we work on this a lot in our organization with our team. Much of this work isn't about us personally. It's about something much larger, which I think goes to the purpose. But I think we have to keep reminding ourselves that it's too easy to allow our egos, to allow our self-gratification, to allow self-aggrandizement, to allow taking credit for things, to allow sort of just being able to write another book based on some set of experiences that arose. Those aren't good enough. Those aren't good enough. I think that we have to remind ourselves what we're really up to here.
Kathy, did you want to respond? Thanks, Rich.
I'll just add 3 words, count to 10.
Count to 10.
Yeah.
I have a thought, but Jeremy, I want your help with where we're at.
Yeah, well, sure. I'm looking at the time, and we're pretty much at our 75-minute mark, and so maybe I can just with apologies to Larry, Berger, and Davis, if you would want to just put your questions into the chat or whatever, it'll give us a chance to lift them up to discuss this, because I do want to say to everyone that we will be having on Thursday, and I just put it in the chat, the link to the event, a follow-up, the way we always do 2 days later, a circle of practice, which is designed for deeper dialogue and times to be more quiet and reflective and explore deeper what arose in today's session, and to practice really deep listening, anchoring. So click on that, and if you can, try to join us on that event on Thursday. And right now, stay around, because if you're able to, we're going to go into breakout groups in a minute, but I did want to right now just give deep appreciation to you, Richard and Kathy and John, for what you shared today. Such wisdom that I'm not going to forget. So much of what I brought in feeling into experiencing what you're sharing today. And thank you, Katy, for having this vision and bringing it to fruition. And it was such a gift to all of us here on the DTN to have this conversation. So as we get ready to go into breakout groups. And again, just as a reminder, after those breakout groups, we're going to get back together in the main room. You don't have to stay around for that if you don't want. It's more just for an informal get back together, just to share whatever's been arising. So many deep emotions, I think, have been brought out in this conversation. I am going to put in the chat a suggested question for us to discuss in the breakout groups. How have you tried to overcome polarization in your own conversations with others holding opposing views? Really a follow-on. in a way from what we were just hearing our panelists talk about. It's just such a rich question for us to explore with each other. So just a big thank you to you all, and hope to see some of you maybe on Thursday, the follow-up. And let's go into breakout groups for 12 minutes, and then let's reconvene, everyone who's able to spend the time, just to informally kind of have a concluding dialogue. Thank you.